What is happening, team? It's Billy McPherson here, and today we're going to run through some camera basics. It's going to help you get off auto mode. Let's get stuck in. Alright, so let's get stuck in. There's three main things that we're going to talk about today, and that's going to be ISO, our shutter speed, and our aperture. We're also going to touch on some white balance, but we'll do that at the end. The first thing to note is that all three of these things are going to affect each other. First, we'll look at ISO. So the big issue around ISO is going to be how much noise you introduce into your image. More ISO will introduce more noise. The lower your ISO, the higher quality your image is going to be, or cleaner, basically. So try and shoot at a low ISO if you can get the exposure right. So basically, guys, ISO, if you bump it up like this, you're going to increase your exposure and it's going to increase the overall brightness of your image. But